Step right up. Climb aboard. The caravan is waiting.
The Grief Reaper. In the beginning was the flame, and in the flame is a language. Frank Bowne made first contact with it in the war when a heap of corpses burned and lit the night with their reek. He was young then, trembling but unbroken, and he struck no flint of his own. Instead, he leaned low among the dancing flames and lit his lucky strike from the pyre's embers, carrying its heat into his lungs and its covenant into his bones. That flame did more than spark a cigarette. It baptized him in the ashes of the dead, the smoke of charred flesh filling his lungs. From that moment, the covenant began, fire and Frank bound together. A man may find his best friend in a dog, but Frank found his in the flames. Fire, like any language, needs someone who can understand. And while most only hear its crackle, Frank heard its words. He understood its tongue all too well, and it never stopped speaking to him. Frank understood without ever learning that fires don't start, they arrive, kin from the first ember. On the voyage home, while other men played cards or dreamed of wives, Frank smoked through the nights, guarding that ember, cigarette by cigarette and candle by candle. When he'd sleep, he ferried the flame across the Atlantic. Storm winds tried to snuff it, salt air clawed at it, but Frank sheltered it like a holy relic. He brought nothing back from the war but that fire, and he never let it die. One cigarette lit from the last, or a candle guttering while he slept, always sparked by the day's final drag. In the morning, he touched the tip of a fresh pull to that candle's wick, and the chain went on. Decades unbroken, half a century carried on a single flame that rose from that pile of hell. He'd never lived a moment without it. The highway was empty at 2:20 in the morning, nothing but blacktop stretching under a waning crescent moon, grinning thin in the Ohio sky. The '73 Chevy Caprice convertible squatted on the shoulder. Brown paint dulled to the color of dried blood, its once proud lines sagging under rust. The vinyl top was torn and sun-cracked, edges curling like old skin. Chrome bumpers grinned dully in the moonlight, and the long body looked more hearse than car. Inside, the seats leaked yellow foam, and the air reeked of smoke, sweat, and old grief that no wash would ever lift. Frank plucked a fresh cigarette from the box and pressed its tip to the dying ember of the one between his lips. As the new cherry caught and glowed, his watery eyes gleamed faintly behind his thick-lensed eyeglasses. He sat there for a moment, breathing smoke with the cigarette between his lips. He pushed the Chevy door open, the hinge groaning into the silence. Gravel shifted under his slow, deliberate steps. Frank never hurried. He carried himself with a faint bounce, a swagger that said he took his time with all things. The payphone stood beside a dark gas station, its glass booth glowing under a buzzing fluorescent like a chapel at the edge of the void. Frank moved through the silence like a priest arriving at his ceremony, not to bless, not to bury, but to exhume. His head was mostly bald, scalp scabbed and shining. A few long hairs clung to the sides, combed back like singed threads, and as he stepped beneath the light, the scabs glistened in the payphone glass like marbles. In one hand, he clutched the planner like a Bible. In the other, he held his cigarette like a crucifix, its ember burning faintly in the dark. The waning crescent hung low in the Ohio sky, pale and cruel, grinning down as though it alone bore witness. He paused at the door, looked up at the thin grin of the moon, and smiled back. Then he stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The air reeked of wet metal and old gum. Frank opened the planner, pages crowded with names and numbers, little symbols and scrawls like a map of grief. Scotch tape clung to the edges of many pages, holding flat matchbooks against the paper like pressed relics. Each family had one, a matchbook carried through its cycle, the first stick lit to consecrate their name, others torn free for calls, letters, or pamphlets. Blackened nubs were used to smear across their tasks, scars on the page. When a family was spent, whether through death, a change of numbers, or simply exhaustion, the empty matchbook was torn out and dropped into the glass vase in the trunk of the Caprice, but not before Frank engraved it with their names so he could remember them and the haunts he gave them. The vase was and is a graveyard of trophies. Sometimes a haunting lasted only months, other times decades. Frank flipped to the Harrison page. Their matchbook was fresh, its cardboard cover creased where his thumb bent it back. He tore the first stick loose and fed a quarter into the slot. Cigarette in hand, he drew one last drag, then plucked the ember from his lips and held it glowing between his fingers. The heat kissed his skin, but he never flinched. He leaned it to the Harrison match, flame catching with a hiss before he drew in, slow, smoke curling against the glass. The cigarette stub went back to his mouth, the chain unbroken, the ritual alive. He dialed the number. The ring stretched long and hollow, once, twice, 3 times, until a woman answered, voice thin with sleep.
Hello?
Frank's eyes bulged, his voice softened, false warmth dripping from every word. Mrs. Harrison, please don't hang up. My name is Daniel. I'm a medium, a psychic medium. I think your husband's been trying to reach me. Daniel was his favorite false name, easy to trust, easier to forget. Her breathing quickened, a tremor in her throat, half sob, half gasp. Frank smiled faintly, eyes closing as if he were savoring a hymn. Her breathing cracked, the first sob spilling raw into the line.
That's cruel.
She whispered,
Don't do this.
I don't take money. This isn't for profit. This is for closure. Frank said with a grin, pressing the lie smooth and warm before finishing. He said I had to find you. Frank bowed his head as if in prayer, eyes closed, lips parting in a faint, pleased smile. He let the silence stretch, drinking in the sound of her breaking until her voice buckled into the words she was afraid to say. Something broke in her throat, a small sound, half sob, half gasp. He kept his eyes closed and tilted his head as if he were a priest listening to a confession.
What did he say?
Frank took a pull from his cigarette and responded before exhaling the smoke. He said he was sorry, that he knows what he cost you. He kept showing me a large circle and an animal, a large animal. Horses, maybe. After that, numbers, lots of numbers, over and over. Do you know what that means? The line went sharp with her breath.
The track.
She said, voice cracking.
That damn track. He ruined us with it. He had a gambling problem. Sports, the lottery, or scratch-offs, and his beloved fucking track. We lost everything. Twice.
He put check marks next to his previous notes in the margin of the Harrison page. Horse racing, loss, trauma. He drew a small flame symbol beside it. And he always ends with fire. Frank said plainly before finishing, does that mean anything to you?
Fire? No. I don't.
Frank cut her off. Ashes, like maybe he's burning.
Oh, but he was buried. I didn't send him to the crematory.
The woman said through tears. Frank switched ears to hear better and squeezed the receiver tighter, savoring the moment. He didn't answer right away. He let her desperation bleed across the wire as he grinned with the cigarette in his mouth. I see. Sometimes I get these images and it's confusing. Maybe he wants you to know he's paying for it, wherever he is. Her sob tore loose, wet and helpless. Frank tilted his head, eyes closed, as though listening to something no one else could hear, a beautiful symphony of sobs to him. He scratched another little flame symbol into the margin with the side of the pencil tip, hand trembling from the pleasure of it. When her crying turned frantic, begging for more, Frank knew he had her right where he wanted her. So he ended it by cutting off her cries with a gentle murmur, almost tender. That's all he can say tonight. He said he'd be in touch with you somehow, some way. And Frank set the receiver down with a click. The silence in the booth was thick, humming with fluorescent buzz. Then the laugh burst from him, wet, broken, jagged.
Oh.
It tore from his throat in ragged pulses before rising into a howl that rattled the windows. Too evil to be human, too wrong, and echoing across the empty highway. The Harrison match burned itself to the nub between his fingers. He let it blacken, smoke curling like a last breath before dragging it across the step one square in the planner. A soot-black bruise bled through the paper. Not a check mark, a wound, a scar of ash. Then he slipped the spent stick into an empty coffee cup he'd scooped up from the floor. Later, it would join the others in the vase. Another family added to the congregation of the dead. He lit another cigarette and turned the planner's page, dragging his nail down to a different family's phone number. He tore out a match from the matchbook and dropped a quarter into the slot. After lighting the match with his cigarette, he dialed the number. An older man's voice answered, confused and wary.
Hello? Who's there?
Frank said nothing. He just stood there listening, letting the match dance in the darkness of the phone booth. On the other end, the voice faltered, uneasy, repeating itself louder now.
Hello? Who is this? I said, who is this? Hello?
When the match died, Frank hung up. He made a note in his planner that the listener on the other end of the line stayed for the entirety of the call, then dropped the blackened stick into the coffee cup next to the remnant of the Harrison match. Next, a third call to another family, a new match from a new page in Matchbook, a woman's voice, brittle with exhaustion.
Hello?
No reply. Only the sound of another match hissing as it burned down. The woman's voice frayed into panic before the line went dead. And so it went. Fourth call, fifth, sixth, 10 in all. 10 numbers dialed from his planner, 10 wounds torn open in the black hours of mourning, widows, sons, daughters. Each voice cracked the silence in a different register, confusion, fear, anger, grief. But Frank gave them nothing in return, only the empty ritual of fire. He let the flame do the talking. Whether they heard its language or not was never his concern. Each click of the receiver felt like the snap of a neck. Sometimes they shouted the names of the departed, desperate, begging to believe it was their loved one calling from beyond. Frank always savored those moments, writing them into his planner with care, extra mournful, written in the notes. They would get priority and another call, letter, or piece of mail that related to the departed in some painful way. When the last call was done, Frank closed the planner with deliberate care, tucking the pencil into its spiral. His reflection in the glass looked pale and monstrous, scalp scabbed and shining under the buzzing light. He smiled faintly at himself, lips twitching with the laughter pressing to get out with the smoke from his latest cigarette. Then he opened the door and stepped back into the night with his coffee cup of freshly burnt matches and his planner. His walk was slow, unhurried, with a faint bounce in the step. Not the shuffle of age, though he was in his late 60s, but the swagger of someone who savored the passage of time. Planner under his arm, cigarette between his lips, he moved like a man leaving church after confession. At the Chevy, he slid into the driver's seat and lit a fresh cigarette. Smoke filled the cab in lazy ribbons. He thought about the families he'd just called, wondering if they were lying in bed crying while remembering their loved ones.
Oh.
The laugh slipped free like a fart, abrupt, ugly, and entirely out of his control. The sound went on until his chest ached and his throat burned raw. When it died, he smiled faintly, wiped his watery eyes, and turned the key. The Chevy rumbled back to life, rolling into the fog. The Caprice 8 miles of blacktop, while the crescent moon sagged toward the horizon, paling as dawn leaked into the fields. Smoke clung to the car's interior, thick and stale, sweetened with the wet rattle of his laugh still echoing in his chest. Frank drove with the window cracked, cold air mixing with the cigarette haze. By the time he reached Andover, Ohio, the sky was bruising gray and the mist was lifting from the ditches. A general store glowed on the corner, its neon beer signs still humming in the windows. Frank pulled in, cut the engine, and stepped out with that same slow gait. Deliberate faint bounce in his step, blazer neat, shoes catching the wet light. Inside, the clerk barely looked at him. Frank bought a fresh pack of cigarettes and a folded newspaper from the counter. He never left a store without buying a fresh pack of smokes. The paper went under his arm, tucked tight against the planner. Across the street, a diner buzzed with its open sign, the pink letters flickering against the thinning dark. He crossed over, pushed through the door, and slid into a corner booth. The air was thick with the smell of grease and last night's bleach. He hurried to get a fresh cigarette lit as his previous one was at its end. The waitress poured his coffee without asking. He set the planner on the table, placed the newspaper beside it, and flipped past the noise. Sports, classifieds, politics, all garbage. His wet finger turned each page until he reached the only one that mattered, obituaries. A faint smile touched his lips, which he licked at the sight of the word obituaries. The day's work had arrived. The waitress returned with a raspberry cheese Danish sweating sugar on wax paper. Frank pulled it close as she topped off his coffee and wrinkled her nose at the smoke.
Lord, and I thought I had a bad habit. You make me look like an angel.
She chuckled, shaking her head.
It's like you're smoking for two.
Frank smiled politely and drew deep. The cherry flared in his glasses like a little eye. Something answered under his ribs, a small tightening, and then eased. He tore into his Danish slowly, chewing too loud, lips smacking in the quiet. Jelly bled across the paper like blood. He dragged his finger through it, lifted it to his mouth, and sucked the sweetness clean. In between bites, he smoked his cigarettes while, against the wind, struggled through the static on the diner radio. When he was done, he wiped his mouth with his sleeve and leaned over the obituaries section of the newspaper. His mouth gaped as his eyes scanned the photographs of the departed. This was his favorite part of the day, the one he always saved for last. The table was empty, but he felt full. Coffee in his veins, sugar in his belly, and now the dead laid out before him like a feast. Frank's watery eyes scanned the column, hungry for the pull. It hadn't always been there. In the early years, he worked blind, guessing which wounds to probe, listening for cracks in voices and hoping they would split wide. But over time, the pull grew into something constant, a pressure, a hum beneath his ribs. Now he trusted it like a compass, an unseen hand guiding his pencil to the names most worth circling. His stub clicked against the margin, pausing only to circle, underline, mark. A young mother, 38. Circled. A father of 2, gone suddenly at 40. Circled, underlined, gone suddenly twice. A boy of 19, gone too soon, forever missed. Circled twice, a star carved beside it. At the top of a fresh sheet, he wrote the word he always did. Prospects. One by one, he listed today's circles and marks from the obituaries, possible futures, possible families to haunt. The spiral notebook lay open beside the planner, its pages worn soft with years of cramped handwriting. Names and dates crowded the lines, little cruelties stacked like bones. He copied from the obituaries with steady devotion, causes of death, survivors' names, scraps of hobbies or jobs when the writer had been careless enough to give him more. Loved fishing, worked at the mill, devoted fan of the Browns. Those were the hooks he could tug on later, threads to stitch the dead back into the living. He underlined them with care, pressing the graphite deep until it carved grooves into the page. Perfect, absolutely perfect, he said with a grin. The planner itself looked like a city map, each square a block of grief, some starred, others marked with flame symbols, circles, or chains of linked dates, pathways of suffering carefully plotted, never rushed. Today's work was simple, waiting in 3 neat lines under today's date. Make call, Wendy Harrison, gambling, check mark. Mail letter, Martin family, overdose letter. Drop AA pamphlets, O'Connor family, drunk driving. He underlined them once with a steady hand, then sipped his coffee. He lit a fresh cigarette with his dying one. Smoke bled upward, clinging to the yellowed ceiling tiles as the smell of bacon spread out over the diner counter and tables. His chest rattled with a small cough, but he smiled faintly at the planner. It was full. His day was full. His life was full. The raspberry filling had smeared across the edge of the newspaper. He dragged his fingernail through the red streak, lifted it slowly, and slipped it between his lips. His tongue worked the jelly clean. Then he drew a box around the next unfinished task for the day, the letter to the Martin family. Time to get to work. Back in the Chevy, he caught sight of a squat motel hunched on the highway's edge, its neon bleeding dull red, vacancy stuttering like a broken heartbeat. He paid in cash at the office without a word, took the brass key on its heavy ring and drove around back. The lot was quiet, every window dark. He killed the engine and lingered for a moment, finishing his cigarette while the Chevy ticked as it cooled. After lighting a fresh cigarette, he stepped out and moved to the rear, that faint bounce in his stride carrying him around the long body of the car. The Caprice's trunk yawned open, coffin-sized, the lid groaning on rusted hinges. Inside, everything lay arranged with reverence. A pressed black suit, his battered Remington, neat bundles of envelopes, stacks of pamphlets lined like scripture. Cartons of cigarettes were stacked tight as bricks. An open crate of matchbooks showed hundreds of little cardboard teeth. Across the back, long white altar candles lay bound in twine, some fresh, waxed smooth and pale, others scarred and shortened, tips black from nights of use. Each was a relic of the flame he carried, fire always at the ready. Tucked beside them rode a small hurricane lantern, chimney cloudy with thumbprints, base dented, and a brass candle holder, both nicked and blackened from long use. And in the corner sat the glass vase, cloudy with soot, 3/4 full. Not just charred sticks, but the husks of entire families. Spent matchbooks bent and torn, their covers scribbled with names, cardboard spines greasy with handling. Hundreds of them, layered deep, their empty teeth like rows of rotten gums. Its mouth was bound in black cloth and twine, part to keep the brittle heap from spilling in the trunk, part to keep what was inside from escaping. A graveyard of grief, proof of work, a congregation of the dead bound together in paper and ash. Frank touched the vase once, rattling the heap so it whispered like bones in a pit. He loosened the cloth cover, careful with the twine, and tipped the day's coffee cup into the vase. Burnt matches slid in with a faint clatter, joining the hundreds already buried there. He stirred them once with his fingers, brittle sticks rasping against glass, rattling like dry teeth in a skull. He brought his ash-dusted hand near his face and inhaled, eyes watering faintly behind his lenses. The smell was acrid, old fire clinging to paper and wood, the proof of his work, a sniff of the past, decades traced back to that first pyre, the reek of human flesh that lit the fuse. Sometimes in the bitter smoke of those charred sticks, he swore he could taste the past itself. Salt air off the Atlantic crossing, the sour sweat of barracks, the stench of bodies stacked and burning. Each breath a reminder that the flame had followed him faithfully through it all. He tied the cloth back tight, sealing the congregation inside. Another family would join them soon. Gathering the typewriter and planner, he carried them inside. The motel room smelled of bleach and old smoke. The mattress sagged in the middle, cigarette burns peppering the blanket. Frank set the typewriter on the scarred desk, rolled a sheet of paper into place, and let his fingers rest on the keys. Before typing, he took a stub of candle from his bag and set it in an ashtray. He leaned his cigarette to the wick until it caught, flame flickering weakly in the stale air. A little tongue of fire, faithful, waiting. He liked it there while he worked, a witness, an accomplice. Frank slid the planner open beside the typewriter, flipping past page after page until he found the square marked with a crude little skull. Martin family, overdose. Their matchbook was taped to the page, cardboard spine bent from use. He tore one free, touched its head to the bright cherry at his mouth, let it char to a black nub, and dropped it in the coffee cup. Then he leaned his cigarette to the wick at his elbow. Flame caught steady, throwing its glow across the scarred desk. The candle would burn while he worked, flame feeding flame, grief feeding grief. Soon it would join the vase in his trunk, the congregation of the dead bound in paper and ash. His watery eyes lingered on the notes he'd written in the margin. Sun, pills, hospital, guitar, noise, never music. Mother wanted silence. He tapped the pencil stub against the paper, eyes watering behind his glasses as if the memory itself delighted him. Months earlier, he'd lingered at the back of a candlelight vigil, head bowed, silent, listening. Voices drifted through the dark, soft and breaking. Frank had stood behind Michael's closest friends and overheard his best friend's voice crack when he told others about Michael saving for a second-hand Fender, playing into the small hours until his mother shouted him down. noise. She always called it noise, never music, and Michael told me that. Another mourner whispered about the hospital stays, the pills, the relapses. That was the wound. Frank had written it down, circled it twice, underlined it deep. The hum in his ribcage had vibrated like a rattlesnake when he'd heard the friend speak of it, grinning around the filter of his cigarette, lips curling back wetly. He leaned over the typewriter. The candle's flame guttered steady at his elbow as the keys struck sharp in the quiet room, each letter punching deep into the page. Ma, if this ever finds its way to you, it's because I'm gone. I'll keep it short and half-assed, since I never put my heart into anything. Your words, remember? The pills weren't to quiet my thoughts. They were to quiet the thoughts of you. You were never there, and now I'll never be there. No more hospital visits. No more guitar noise. Noise. Never music. No more anything. Happy. Now you can enjoy the silence you so desperately yearned for, and may these words forever echo in each moment of that silence. Michael. He didn't type so much as jab, each finger lifting high, hanging there a moment, then coming down hard like a hammer, awkward and deliberate, one letter at a time. The clack of metal striking paper broke the silence, steady and cold. Every word was meant to wound. When it was finished, Frank tore the sheet from the roller, cigarette clamped in the corner of his mouth. He held the page up to the light, exhaling smoke across the black, even type of the typewriter. Not a trace of him in it. No handwriting, just ink poured from Michael's deceased heart, spoken from his mourning friends' mouths. It could have been written the night Michael died. When he reread the last two lines, he grinned long and wide with a cigarette in his mouth. He folded the page carefully, creasing it flat with the side of his thumb, rubbed a streak of ash along the margin until it looked handled, lived in. Then he slipped it into an envelope, rolled the Remington closer, and typed out the Martins' address one deliberate keystroke at a time. Awkward, slow, each hammer blow like carving their grief into stone. And with the finishing touch of a perfectly placed crooked stamp, the letter was done. A letter that would arrive late, but better late than never. The post office was notorious for losing a letter. His grin widened as he sealed it shut. Tomorrow the Martins would open it, and the wound they thought had scarred would tear raw again. Mrs. Martin most of all. A consolation prize would be watching her husband turn on her, blaming her instead of Michael. It's always easier to hate the living than to grieve the dead. Frank grinned harder at the thought. The laugh bubbled up, wet and broken, rattling in his chest. When the fit of laughter passed, he wiped drool from the side of his mouth with his sleeve, still grinning through his smoke-stained teeth, while the candle burned steady at his elbow, flame feeding flame, grief feeding grief. He plucked the Martin match from the cup, its blackened stick still faintly warm, and dragged it across the square in his planner for today's work. A smear, jagged and dark, not a check mark, but a wound, a fresh wound. When the matchbook ran dry, its husk would join the vase in his trunk. Another family swallowed into ash, another voice added to the congregation. More fire, more grief. The envelope sat on the desk, neat and cruel, waiting. Frank slipped it under his arm with the planner and stepped out into the daylight. The Caprice carried him 3 blocks to the town's post office, a squat brick building with a blue drop box hunched at the curb. He rolled down the window, cigarette dangling, and slid the letter through the slot. The flap clanged shut like a cell door. By the end of the week, Mrs. Martin would open it and find her son's ghost scratching at her heart. Not every cruelty required his presence. Sometimes he let the postman do his dirty work for him, a silent accomplice who carried grief from town to town. But other times Frank liked to see the homes himself, to watch the curtains drawn against their shame, to breathe the air of their yards, to know exactly where his wound was festering. That was today's pleasure. That was next. Frank drove on, smoke leaking from the cracked window, and flipped the planner open across his lap. His watery eyes blinked at the next square. One more task for the day, one more wound to keep open. The O'Connors. Frank turned to the O'Connor family page. A rusted paperclip held their obituary against the margin, its edges yellowing. The obituary had been polished, almost saintly. Taken too soon in a tragic accident. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to Alcoholics Anonymous. Frank had clipped it weeks ago, underlined the line twice. That was the wound, not the crash, not the coffin, but the admission buried between polite words, the shame left for others to see. Now, in the Caprice, he rolled toward their street. On the passenger seat, AA meeting schedules and addiction counseling flyers. Marketing for the living, a fresh reminder, folded neat, lifted from a church bulletin rack 2 towns back. He also had an AA notepad, clean top sheet waiting. Frank lit a fresh cigarette off the dying one in his mouth, chain unbroken, then set the stub to smolder in the ashtray. He grinned, took up a pencil, and wrote in his neat block hand, "In hell, Jimmy doesn't get the bottle anymore. He's drying out. Trouble is, his tears and breath run 86 proof. He's crying hard for you. Each sob fans the coals, hotter, brighter, and longer. Can you see the flames light yet? Can you hear its hiss or smell the ash? Can you feel the heat? Jack Daniels." He folded the page once, squared the crease with his thumb, and tapped ash across the margin so it looked handled. When he was done, the laugh burst up from the hum inside him, wet and broken, a pressure valve letting go, and the Caprice filled with that old, sweet stink of smoke and victory.
Oh.
He slipped it into a plain envelope, sealed it flat with the firm press of his palm, and laid it on top of his planner. With the letter done, he ripped a fresh match from the O'Connor matchbook and held it to the cherry at his mouth. The flame hissed an orange and blue eruption. He burnt the edges of the AA pamphlet inspired in the moment. The pamphlet said, "We saved you a seat. Come home." Home for Jimmy was the flame, and Frank wanted to get the point across. With the letter and pamphlet done, he reached under his seat and found an empty shot bottle of Jack. He unscrewed the lid and dropped the burnt match inside. He'd leave it behind with the envelope and burnt flyer. Some trophies were worth leaving behind, especially if they'd provided the sting. By dusk, he was parked 2 streets over from the O'Connor house, a neat little ranch set back on a quiet lane. The sky was bruising purple, the air heavy with the hum of insects. Frank walked slow, planner under his arm, cigarette glowing between 2 fingers. His steps were unhurried, that faint bounce in his stride carrying him forward like he had nowhere else to be. At the mailbox, he slid the envelope in, casual, as though it belonged there. On top of it, he placed the AA flyers and plastic bottle of Jack with the match inside. The metal flap clicked shut, a sound he savored like a note of music. He lingered on the sidewalk, smoke leaking from his mouth as he studied the house, curtains drawn, porch light buzzing. Somewhere inside, the widow telling herself it had been an accident, that the whispers didn't matter, that he hadn't been drunk. Frank's lips peeled back. He covered his mouth with his hand, shoulders hitching, and the laugh seeped out, wet, broken, rattling. Back in the car, he flipped the planner open to the O'Connor page and tore a single stick from the matchbook taped there. He touched its head to the bright cherry at his mouth, burned it low in the ashtray until it blackened, then smeared the square with its charred tip, a jagged streak pressed deep into the paper. Not a check mark, a wound, a fresh wound. No healing necessary, just grief, righteous and belonging. Beneath it, in block letters, he wrote the next cruelty in the chain. Phone call in 2 months, pretend bartender who found something of his in the lost and found at the tavern. The Chevy slid back onto the highway, smoke leaking from the cracked window. Frank drove with no urgency, only that faint bounce in his shoulders, savoring the hours between cruelties. He told himself he was finished for the day. A drink would sand the edges. The sports bar reeked of sweat, fryer grease, and stale beer. Neon signs buzzed over men barking at the television, their faces washed in Budweiser light. Frank took the far end of the counter, blazer neat, a cigarette burning low. He drank slow, one, then another, letting the noise roll over him like weather. The bartender slid a fresh whiskey and a free matchbook across the wood.
You want another ashtray? You're burning them like there's 2 of you,
he said, amused. Frank palmed the matchbook, just keeping the light. He let a soft breath out through his nose, the hint of a chuckle that wasn't quite his. By the 3rd whiskey, an idea arrived, simple as a shrug, not a plan, so much as a habit stretching its legs. With the arrival of a good buzz came the memories of his phone call with Mrs. Harrison. He laughed to himself at the bar in between drinks and cigarettes, at the idea of her telling her loved ones about a psychic medium, contacting her with a message from her departed husband. He rose with that slow, savoring bounce and slipped into the restroom. Tiles cracked, air sour with piss and bleach. In the stall, he balanced the planner on his knee and uncapped a black Sharpie. The thick smell filled the stall as he pressed the tip to the metal. To place bets, call 5558854. Bold, steady, permanent, ink that would cling for years, long after he'd left the town behind. Every drunk, every degenerate, every gambler who stumbled in to piss away a night would see it, and sooner or later one of them would dial. The widow's phone would ring, the wound would split, and she'd never know why it never healed. Frank capped the marker, tucked the planner away, and flushed the toilet for the noise of it. At the sink, he washed his hands slow, staring at his bald scalp, mottled with scabs in the yellow mirror light. His lips curled faintly, and then he laughed while staring at himself in the mirror and thinking about the drunken assholes who would call Mrs. Harrison to place bets. They would save money, and she'd get a fresh reminder of her wound. A win-win. When he stepped back into the roar of the bar, the game blared on. Nobody noticed. He finished his drink and a fresh cigarette at the counter, smoke trailing from his mouth as if nothing had happened. He threw a couple of old $1 bills on the bar top and then slipped out into the night. The Caprice waited in the lot, hulking under a dead street lamp. He drove slow through one street light, savoring the silence until he rolled up on the motel he'd gotten a key and room for earlier. The room stank of bleach and old smoke. Frank unpacked slow, setting his planner on the desk, his cigarettes on the nightstand. From the trunk, he'd brought one of the long white candles, its wax already nicked and blackened from use. He placed it on the table beside the sagging bed. The cigarette in his hand burned low. He leaned forward, pressed the cherry into the wick, and dragged deep until the wax hissed and the flame caught. A thin light trembled in the stale room, shadows stretching up the wall like reaching arms. Frank watched it steady itself, then crushed the old cigarette flat in the ashtray. He lay back on the sour sheets, smoke still clinging to his clothes, and let the flame keep its vigil. His eyes stayed open a long while, watery and shining in the flicker. When he finally drifted off, it was shallow, twitching rest, the kind of sleep that left him ready to wake at the faintest sound. By 4 a.m., the candle was guttering low, wax run in hard rivers down its side. Frank lit a fresh cigarette from its wick, drew in the smoke with a satisfied grunt, and blew the candle out. The chain was unbroken. He checked the planner before he shut the motel door. Today's square was mostly blank. No appointments, just a single line in his cramped hand. Prospecting. That was the plan. No plan at all. Let the day open like a wound and see what bled. Then he was back on the road, the Chevy rolling through pale mist in search of new families to haunt. He drove on for a couple hours into Pennsylvania, passing by cemeteries by chance. No, he didn't drive toward cemeteries on purpose. He let the pull guide him, that gift he'd grown to cherish over time, a radar to grief and wounds worth nurturing. Some cemeteries drew nothing. They left him cold. Others vibrated through him like a tuning fork, the graves themselves calling. He drifted from exit to exit, waiting for it to catch. And this morning he felt it tugging at him, reeling him in slow like a fish it didn't want to lose. He was getting closer, the warmth from an ember calling out to him. Frank exited the vehicle, grabbed his planner, and started walking the grounds to find a prospect or more if he was lucky. This one found him easy. An old cemetery slouched on a hill, iron gate rusted through. It pulled at him like a magnet. Some plots were cold, left him hollow. Others hummed in his bones. Frank slipped through the rows with his usual slow bounce, the planner tucked under his arm, smoke riding his shoulder like a stray spirit. He read the stones the way other men read ledgers, names, dates, little carvings that told on the dead, a fish, a cross, a pair of praying hands. Some plots were cold and clean, grass grown flush over the hurt. Years since a visitor paid it a visit. Others still murmured, fresh flowers browning at the edges, a ribbon damp with dew, a child's toy turned on its side, collecting rain. Those were the rarest and the sweetest, the long griefs that wouldn't quit, proof the wound still breathed somewhere out there. He hoped for one of those. He found none thus far today. He made a slow circuit to the gate and back, waiting for the hum to grip him and shake. Nothing. He was halfway to closing the trunk when he heard it. Engines on the road, low and workmanlike. 2 trucks nosed in through the iron teeth of the gate and bumped across the grass. Men in coveralls climbed down unrolled green carpet, set their shovels, and began to bite a rectangle out of the earth. A tent went up. Folding chairs followed. The hum in Frank's ribs woke hard and bright. A tuning fork struck and held. He watched from the front seat, cigarette glowing, the air in the Chevy tightening with the promise of it. This was why he was here. He could feel it. He watched the men from start to finish through a set of his binoculars from the Caprice while chain-smoking his cigarettes. When they were done, Frank made a move. He parked on the shoulder and opened the trunk. The hinges groaned. Inside, everything lay in its place. The typewriter, the bundles of envelopes, the stacks of pamphlets, and hanging neat on its wire hanger, his black suit, jacket pressed, slacks folded sharp. He changed in the front seat, moving slow, savoring the ritual. When he leaned back in his seat and lifted his hips to pull the slacks up, he farted sudden and silent. It was rotten as stale coffee and raspberry cheese gone sour, leaking out of him. He snorted a laugh to himself before buttoning the pants. The white shirt went on crisp, collar high against his throat. The jacket last, buttoned snug, planner slipped into the inside pocket. He studied his reflection in the rearview mirror. Bald scalp, scabbed and shining, glasses crooked, but dressed he could pass for anyone. A mourner, a neighbor, a friend. For hours he lingered in the car, chain-smoking one lucky after another, the ashtray filling with crooked gray spines. He thumbed through the planner, reread his notes, jotted small cruelties in the margins. Now and then he cracked the window to flick a butt, watching the smoke bleed out into the morning air. Time wasn't wasted. It was steeped, like tea left to grow darker, bitterer. When the first caravan of cars began rolling up the hill, Frank cracked the passenger door and set an empty coffee tin on the floor mat, the metal cold against his knuckles. One of the long white altar candles slid into the tin with a soft clink. He touched the cherry of his cigarette to the wick and waited until the flame stood up on its own, thin and steady. A sentry. The Chevy filled with a warm, breathless glow, smoke braided with candle wax. He left the window open a thumb's width and closed the door gently as if he were leaving a chapel. Walking across the field, shoes damp with dew, Frank moved with his familiar swagger. Not hurried, not slow, but deliberate, savoring each step, a faint bounce in his stride. The tent was crowded, folding chairs set in neat rows, mourners black as crows. The widow collapsed into herself, held up by trembling relatives. Children clung to her sleeves, faces twisted in fear and confusion. The sound of their grief rose sharp and raw as the casket lowered into the hole. Frank sat near the back, planner folded in his lap, pen ready, ears listening, eyes watching. He scribbled the dead man's name, circled the survivors, drew a star in the margin. His watery eyes glistened as though he wept with them. But it wasn't sadness. It was the laugh pressing at his throat. He bit down on it until his jaw ached, but when the widow's sobs peaked, he rose abruptly and walked out, shoulders hunched like a man overcome, past the trees into the mist. He bent forward with his hands on his knees, chest shaking, and then it broke loose. The laugh tore out of him, wet, broken, jagged. It wheezed, coughed, rose into a howl that rattled the fog. When it finally died, he wiped his wet face and straightened his jacket. His walk was the same as always when he returned to the Chevy, slow, unhurried, savoring the time, planner tucked neat against his chest. At the trunk, he took out a fresh matchbook, then shut it soft. In the driver's seat, he flipped open the planner, drew a star beside the family's names, and wrote in clean block letters, "Wait 6 months. First phone call. Pretend to be a psychic medium." Then he taped the matchbox and ripped out a fresh one, burned it down to ash, and smeared it across the square until it tore the page. A wound for the funeral. Another family marked. A faint smile tugged at his lips as he lit another cigarette, smoke curling across his glasses. The Chevy rolled back onto the highway. Frank drove on, chasing nothing but the high of opening a fresh wound. He knew they were out there waiting for him. It was his job to find them. The Chevy hummed along the highway, smoke trailing from the cracked window of a freshly lit cigarette. Frank's watery eyes blinked behind his glasses. The planner rode shotgun, fat with names. He drove slow, savoring the emptiness, the faint bounce in his gait, now living in his hands on the wheel as the Caprice drifted through long ribbons of road, woods, and low hills, unspooling somewhere in Pennsylvania. Then he saw it. Up ahead, a small white wooden cross leaned at the foot of a giant tree. Fresh flowers trembled in the evening air. A stuffed bear slumped against the post, fur wet with dew, a name scrawled in black marker across the cross, the letters already bleeding in the weather. The pull hit him sharp, low in his belly, his lips peeled back in a grin. He eased onto the gravel and killed the engine. Frank stepped out, blazer neat, shoes catching the weak light, scalp mottled with scabs that gleamed with sweat. The air carried the sweet metal smell of a deep, fresh wound, cut flowers bleeding green, their perfume mixed with the Caprice's exhaust. He lifted his head and sniffed as he walked toward the bouquets. Nothing like the smell of fresh grief, of mourning, of death. He said aloud to no one. His shoes scuffed the gravel while a knife-thin waning crescent cut into the sky and the wound bled night. He bent low, planner open in one hand, pencil trembling in the other with excitement. The rattlesnake hum inside of him chattered and buzzed. He whispered the name as he wrote it down, mouth wet with excitement. It was as if he were an archaeologist stumbling into a rare dinosaur fossil. He circled her name once, twice, pressed the tip deep until it tore the page. Then he tore a stick from a fresh matchbook, touched its head to the bright cherry at his mouth, let it char, and smeared the warm carcass across the margin. A new family, a new wound. His body quivered with joy. He popped the trunk and took out one of the tall glass prayer candles and walked back to the shrine. He knelt, palmed the spent tea light next to the cross, and traded his tall glass prayer candle with it. He leaned the cherry at his mouth to the blackened wick until it bloomed. The new flame blinked once and held, glass turning it into a tiny chapel for strangers to slow for, whisper a name to, or pray at if they felt the need. Drivers would pass and tap their brakes, and they would remember. That was Frank's work, keeping grief fresh, keeping the dead where they belonged, raw and open in the minds of the living. The flame in the jar sputtered once, bent, then steadied. Next, he touched the cherry to the small tea-light candle he'd stolen from the memorial, binding it to him, to his fire, to the covenant that began half a century ago on the heap of burning bodies. One ember carried through time, still communicating, still finding grief worth sparking. The little tea light in the ashtray leaned toward him like a compass needle finding north. When he got back into the car, he lifted a hand to his temple and found one of those long side hairs and plucked it. The sting bloomed a pinprick. He held the strand over the tea light and let the heat take it. It sizzled to a curl, then flared, a thin blue lick turning to black ash between his fingers. At its peak flame, Frank's silhouette was cast in the car. A hooded figure cloaked him as a shadow as the sweet, rotten tang of burnt keratin filled the air around him. Frank put the car in drive, and the Caprice shouldered back onto the highway. The flowers decorating the memorial and death site began to slump from the Caprice's wicked exhaust fumes. Frank watched in the rear view with a smile as the memorial candle glistened as a bead of fire shrinking to a dot, then to darkness. Even though he couldn't see it anymore, it didn't mean it wasn't still there. Deep within the darkness, doing its thing, dancing, whispering, and lighting fires in others who would listen. Smoke braided the cab as he smoked his cigarette. In the passenger window, his reflection didn't quite fit the man behind the wheel. Shoulders broader, a hood bending where his scalp should be. He took a deep breath and watched the tea light candle flame dance in the dark as his laugh came back again, doubled.
Oh.
Frank understood his ember was one of many. The jar in the trunk keeps its trophies, families pressed flat, names on cardboard teeth, because the fire seeks its own and never loses the scent. One night soon, a dry wind would run the length of the planet, and the embers would wake and find one another, speaking in sparks, until the long burn begins. And when the burning is finally done, one small ember will remain, heat with a memory, waiting in the dark for the Creator's breath to begin again, because in the end is the flame, the same ember that started it all. Life itself was the wax, melting in its own good time. And Frank, well, Frank was the wick. And the flame, remember, I already told you, is a language, the language of hell. And fire, like any language, needs someone who can understand. Hear it, and it hears you. Yes, I mean you. You've been listening to it this entire time. You set your wick of curiosity to my voice, and I took. I'm inside now, burning as an ember kept beneath the ash you make of your days, waiting for a single breath. If you felt it flare in you even for a second, you understand the language. You've been answering without knowing, ember to ember, my flame to your wick. And for those of you who don't know by now, look around. I'm here in the flame nearest to you. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Look closely, it's me. The Grief Reaper.
Thanks for watching. I hope you were scared to death. If your heart's still beating, like and share. And if you dare, subscribe for more delicious horror. We'll be waiting, right here in the dark.